In our last session, we took a look at Acts chapter 24, 25, and 26. We saw that Paul preached in all circumstances, and God allowed him opportunities to proclaim the gospel before the governor of Judea, Felix, his successor, Festus, and even the king of Jerusalem, Agrippa himself. Paul had the opportunity then to go to Rome and proclaim his case before Caesar. In doing so, God demonstrated His sovereignty over Paul's life in a very unique way, so that Paul had the opportunity to proclaim the gospel not only in Jerusalem, not only in Judea, but to the rest of the world. God's initial plan in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8 is coming to fruition. Paul, as a missionary, as a person who proclaims the gospel, is sent out to do that very thing, even if the circumstances weren't at the best that they could be. I think God does the same for us, provides us with opportunities to share the gospel in whatever position, whatever situation in life we are called. At work, at the church, at home, out in the world, we are called to be a testimony of who Christ is and what He's done. Well, today we'll skip ahead a few books to the end of the Bible, Revelation. It's the end of the New Testament, the end of the Bible, and Revelation was one of, if not the last book to be written. We know it was written by a man named John. Most believe it was the Apostle John while he was exiled to the island of Patmos. The story goes that the emperor at the time, Domitian, in the 90s, so in 90s AD, had John tortured, had him dipped in boiling oil, but that John survived. And because of that, they exiled him to an island just a little southwest of the port city of Ephesus in present-day Asia Minor. Patmos is a small island. John was sent there, and we see he had this very unique experience, this revelation on Patmos. The revelation of John is a powerful reminder that God reveals Himself, the Redeemer reveals Himself in all of His glory. In Revelation chapter 1, we see Jesus reveals His glory. I want us to read Revelation chapter 1, starting in verse 9. I, John, your brother, and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. And it said this, "Write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea." I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all of its brilliance. The book of Revelation is a beautiful, beautiful tapestry woven together of images of the Son of Man, Jesus Himself. We see in the book of Revelation that John was writing, here in verse 9, he's a brother to the people to whom he's writing, and a fellow sufferer. You see, at the time of John's writing, Domitian was the emperor. Domitian was not a friendly person to Christians. In fact, again, he tried to have John murdered by boiling him in oil, and it was only because God's protection that John was spared and exiled to the island of Patmos. In this island, he had this dream vision while he was in the Lord's day. He was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Don't confuse this with the day of the Lord, which is back in 1 Thessalonians. We see that this is different. The construction is different. The day of the Lord. Most likely it was a Sunday, a time where John was worshiping and reflecting on who God is and what He'd done. We see that John was here on the Lord's day in the Spirit when he had a vision. We know that this vision tells us about Jesus. But this vision also tells us not only about Jesus, it tells us about the rest of the book of Revelation. You see, oftentimes we read Revelation so that we can figure out the days and the times and the figures and all of the numbers and match things with our current context and culture. And while I agree that Revelation has significance for our own context and culture, I would disagree that it was intended to provide a roadmap for the future. You see, when John is writing here, he's writing to his brothers and those who are companions in suffering. And he's writing to show them who Jesus is, how they can live rightly, that Jesus will one day conquer, that the enemies of Jesus will be destroyed, and that those who worship and follow Jesus will live with him forever. Where Genesis ends in death and destruction and sin entering the world, Revelation ends in hope, renewal, beauty, perfection, and sinlessness. It's the culmination of Genesis. It's the renewal from Genesis. It's the garden given rebirth. And here in the story of Revelation chapter 1, we see this Jesus figure. This figure that we're not told it's Jesus yet, but we know it's a Jesus figure. We know it's Jesus. We see this figure in all of his glory, in all of his splendor. Notice the descriptors that John uses. He turned around and he saw these 7 golden lampstands, and among them was one like the Son of Man, in verse 13. This language harkens back to Daniel chapter 7 in verse 13, where the Son of Man comes on the clouds and is presented before the Ancient of Days. I love this image here of the Son of Man who's dressed in a robe and with a golden sash. We see this kingly, this divine, this priestly imagery being brought up here. The priests and the kings would wear robes and sashes as a way of respect and adoration. It was a sign of stateliness, a sign of honor. And they would wear these, and we notice in verse 14 that his hair was white like wool, pure white, and that his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. And in his right hand he held 7 stars. So backing up a little bit in verse 11, we see 7 churches, all churches in the province of Asia, in Asia Minor. All churches, some were started by Paul, some were started by others, who worshiped Jesus. John is writing specifically to them. This voice told John, write these words to these 7 churches. And this is what you're to write. And so he sees the 7 lampstands. And he sees 7 stars in the palm of the hand of the Son of Man. And they're to be sent to the 7 churches. 7 in Revelation is a number of perfection. It's the number of completion. And here John wants us to know the totality of what Jesus is doing, who he is. This is the culmination. I love the imagery here that Jesus reveals himself in all of his glory. And when we start to look at the glory of Jesus, we recognize that Jesus didn't want Revelation to be written to give us the answer to who the Antichrist is, or to help us understand whether or not the European Union is the nations that will rise up against Israel. That's not the point. We don't even know who the 144,000 are. We don't know when all of this will take place. But we see concretely and clearly that the Son of Man reveals himself. And in this moment, there's an opportunity for awe, for reverence, and for worship. And I think it's a beautiful picture for us to recognize that Jesus was divine, and he revealed himself as such. Continuing on, we see that Jesus reveals his authority over time and death. In verse 17, we read, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, 'Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades.'" I love, again, the picture here of Jesus revealing his authority over time, death, and hell. One of the fascinating things with verse 17, if you take your Bibles and go back to Exodus 33 and 34, we read an interesting narrative about Moses and his interaction with God on Mount Sinai. we see in Exodus 33 and 34, the 10 tablets, or the 2 tablets that had the 10 commandments, had been smashed. And Moses went back up to Mount Sinai. And there at Mount Sinai, he met with the Lord, and he communed with him, and the Lord, Yahweh God, wrote down the tablets, on the tablets, the law a second time. What's interesting, though, about Exodus 34 is that when Moses went up the mountain, God descended in a cloud, and we see Moses fall on his face. But God says, "Don't be afraid. I am the Lord your God. I am full of mercy and compassion, a God who is gracious and loving, who is slow to anger, who forgives to the 3rd and the 4th generation." It is such an incredible picture when John falls face first on the ground as though he were dead. Jesus places his hand on his head and says, "Fear not." You see, Jesus in this moment was taking on the persona, the person of the covenant God, Yahweh, and was restoring John just as Yahweh God restored John in Exodus chapter 34, or restored Moses in Exodus chapter 34. And we notice similar language. "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last." You see, in that text in Exodus 34, God uses descriptions of himself. I am Yahweh God. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am slow to anger. I'm compassionate and merciful. And we see then that Jesus ascribes to himself similar titles, yet some unique ones. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. Notice what he says in verse 18 using the past tense. "I was dead, and now look, I'm alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades." I love it, right? What Jesus is saying is, John, don't be afraid. You are speaking with Jesus. Now, if this is John the apostle who had spent time with Jesus, this must have been a powerful moment. It's almost like a family reunion. John, the beloved apostle, the one who took care of Jesus' mother, Mary, is now bowing at the feet of Jesus, revealed in all of his glory, and Jesus says, "Don't be afraid. This is who you're talking with." It does a couple of things. Number one, it tells us that the image that John saw here in chapter 1 was so much different than the picture he had of Jesus in his earthly ministry. See, Jesus we often think of as this humble, maybe even ugly guy who walked on the earth. We take Isaiah 53. He had no appearance that people should be drawn to him. And we think he was just this kind of normal, just a normal guy, a little homely. He wasn't anything to write home about. But now, in his glorified state, Jesus is this glowing, brilliant, powerful, mysterious figure who reveals himself to John and stands before John, and John is terrified until Jesus speaks to him and says, "Don't be afraid." And then he reveals that he is the one who is over time. He's the first and the last. He was dead, but now is alive. He has the power over death, and he holds the keys to death and Hades. He is the one who has authority over those things. Jesus has the authority, and he reveals that to John. But he reveals one final thing here, his presence among the churches. This is where I think there are some significant moments for us to discuss the hope that's found in Jesus. Starting in verse 19, we read, "Write therefore what you have seen, what is now and what will take place later." That is the vision that John is about to have. "The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and of the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." In Jewish mythology, specifically in the book of Enoch, 1 Enoch, we see some really interesting things related to kind of Jewish conceptions of who God is and what angels are. We read that God has a number of archangels, Raphael, Uriel, Michael, Gabriel, among others. And God sends, and he has power to send these archangels to do his bidding, his work on the earth. Now we see this as well in Luke chapter 2. We see the angel appearing to Mary and to Joseph. We see the angel of the Lord back in Joshua appearing to Joshua. We see these types of images all over the place. But what we see here that's so interesting is not an angel of the Lord that appears. It's Jesus himself that appears to John. But Jesus himself says, I hold in my hands the 7 stars, and these 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and I control them and I command them. And the lampstands that I'm standing in the midst of, those lampstands all around me are the 7 churches. And John, I want you to know, the message that I'm proclaiming now, the message that you will continue to hear through the book of Revelation, and the image that you see of me, write it down and send it to the churches so that they may have hope, that they may be encouraged, that they may be inspired to stand strong in the face of persecution, that they may be inspired to proclaim the gospel clearly, that they may be inspired to stand firm when they're tempted to fall away into sin because the world around them is asking them to cave in just a little bit, just sacrifice to one of my gods. Just cheat a little bit or steal a little bit or do some unethical work in your job. It's okay if you cheat on your husband or your wife. That's fine because culture tells you it's okay. But John said, no, that's not right. And Jesus is going to proclaim the one who perseveres is the one who will be redeemed. And here in Revelation chapter 1, John is proclaiming what he's seeing. Jesus in all of his glory, telling John, I want you to write a message to the churches. I want you to tell them to persevere, stand against temptation, fight against temptation, and persevere until Christ returns. The message of Revelation is a message of inspiration, of hope, and encouragement. I would hope that you would read Revelation with an eye toward what God is doing, what God has done, and what God will do in the future. Not necessarily to find out all of the details about who the Antichrist, who the nations, who the dragon, who the beast, or who all of those things might be. Look at the bigger picture, the meta-narrative, so to speak, the story of Revelation from the beginning to the end. What God does through Jesus in the churches and among the people in those churches. I think you'll find a really interesting story that's being written. And as Jesus reveals himself to inspire hope and encouragement among the people. We're not going to take a look at the letters, Revelation 3 and 4, but I would encourage 2, 3, and 4. I would encourage you, read the letters to the 7 churches. I would encourage you to think about what Jesus is saying through these letters to the churches, how he wants them to live, how he wants them to follow, and what are some repeated phrases that he uses throughout all of those letters. It tells us what Jesus wants us to know. It tells us what Jesus wanted John to know and what he wanted John's audience to know. Read Revelation 1 through 3. Tackle some of the questions. Ask what's repeated. Ask what is emphasized. Talk about, look at the imagery, and see what Jesus is revealing about himself. I think you'll find some really interesting things. Not only does Jesus reveal his glory, not only does he reveal that he has power over authority, time, death, and Hades, but Jesus reveals that he is among the churches, that he is with them, that he is helping them, that he is guiding them. For us, that should cause us great hope and joy. That should cause us the ability to stand firm and put up with all of the things that we face in this world. And we don't face things half as bad, a third as bad, or even a 1% as bad as what John and his peers faced in that time. But I think we can find some hope just as much as they can. So study the scripture, Revelation 1 through 3, and see what hope Jesus provides to the churches.